Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Dev Talk Show here on May 5th, 2025. It's a little past 8 here on the U.S. East Coast, and I'm here with my co-host, Rich Ross. How are you this Monday morning?
Good morning, Chris. Yeah, doing well. Ready to start a nice another week, as it were. So,
Yeah. All right.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. We had a little bit of rain in our area, but a pretty relaxing weekend, or at least tried to be as much as possible. And Monday came too quick for me this time. So I think sometimes, look, I'm not sure it ever is welcome.
Right.
But some weekends seem longer. So in any case.
Especially with 3 Game 7s in the NHL playoffs here.
Oh, that's true.
Right?
I did.
Saturday, one last night.
I did watch a couple of them, at least the ending. I caught the ending of last night's Winnipeg St. Louis game, but I did not see what led up to it. And so when it ended, I have I have a streaming TV service, and it's got like this cloud DVR. And so a while ago, I just told it, I used to try and remember to have it record games or record things I was interested in. And now I've realized that you can tell it to record entire topics. Nice. So I've just said, if it's hockey, I don't care. I don't care. So I'll get college hockey, everything, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Oh, wow.
And so the nice thing about that is because it recorded it when they were talking about the comeback, I was able to say well, now that I've seen what happened, let me scroll back and watch those last 2 minutes of the third. So if there are any Winnipeg or St. Louis fans watching, right. If you're a St. Louis fan, who I know one, Jeff Strauss, who is a good friend of mine. I met him at the MVP Summit. Talk about someone who cares so much about the community that at MVP Summit he would be part of putting together as a conference organizer himself with years of experience and tons of great tips for other conference organizers. He would put together this awesome meetup of conference organizers where we would all talk about the trials and tribulations of being a conference organizer. And he's such a really great developer relations, just expert. He really understands that space. And he's a huge St. Louis Blues fan.
Oh,
so I'm sure that was impossible.
A little heartbreaking. Yeah.
It'd be great if somehow, wouldn't it be something if the YouTube algorithm picked it up and said man, I don't know how this would even be possible. Maybe a little weird privacy stuff, and showed this to Jeff, because Jeff, if you were watching, I feel you. And even as bad as the Kings collapse was, it could not have been as heartbreaking as those last 2 minutes of the third. So that said, let's talk about the Orbital app.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good on a Monday to work your way into the conversation here. So part of this is us just being able to talk at this time of the morning on a Monday.
Yeah, that's true. Cool. So the title for the show today is choosing deployment options for an API to back your SPA app, which is going to be great for people trying to understand what the heck this is about. And if you've been following along in the app, what we have so far is we have a Blazor WebAssembly Standalone front end. We're using, I think we started in the .NET 9 timeframe, but instead of using Blazor Web App, which is the relatively new project template that gets you Blazor with render modes, islands of interactivity, Blazor United, all of those buzzwords from the .NET 8 release. You get Blazor WebAssembly Standalone, which means it's more like a SPA. Everything runs in the WASM client. I think you and I just wanted to try it out, and which is funny because it was a little contrarian to the hotness of the new render mode stuff that came out in .NET 8. We were planning to also say, let's use this opportunity to really dive into .NET Aspire. Moving a little past the tutorial stage of hey, I watched a tutorial on this. I think I can let's use it. Let's use it. And to back it with an API. So, your SPA front end is talking to an API to do its work. I think originally your idea was let's use Azure Functions because there is specific support in Azure Functions to help you in this process of SPA to backend. I'm going to pick on the easy thing, but it's more than just this. One thing it does is it eliminates CORS issues because they take care of that. They take care of the same origin problem for you, which I've actually never tried using it. So it'll be interesting to get there. And I think also by using Azure Functions, I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are. But if you have other Azure resources backing it, you're a little bit closer to it being quote unquote easy to just use things like service identities, or did I get that wrong? Managed identities or service principals to just basically, I might have gotten the terminology a little bit off, but so that way your Azure Functions section can access the other things. Everything's managed. You're not managing accounts. You're not managing passwords, all that stuff.
Yep. Yeah. With the managed identities. Absolutely. So all of that just kind of seamlessly happens. The other cool thing, and this is one of the things I love about Functions, is Azure Functions gives you the ability to do binding. So not all of the services in Azure, but there's a good list of them that are in there for Functions to essentially have access to that service or the object in that service that you want to work on. So for example, we're using Cosmos DB as our backend data store. As we go through this, there are binding capabilities inside of Azure Functions to not only trigger on events that happen in Cosmos database, but also on the inbound saying, well, here's the document I want you to, that has the information you're looking for, or on the outbound, save everything you just did by getting this request in out to a document, into a document item in Cosmos DB. So all of those capabilities are things that you kind of get for free that you just have to wire up the configuration for where that Cosmos DB instance lives. And that's pretty awesome because it takes some of the stuff we've been doing with, hey, instantiate the Cosmos client, connect to the Cosmos database, those kind of things out of the scope of what we need to worry about, because it's just pointing to where that service lives essentially. So,
yeah. So now let's backing up just a second. I think we can also talk about where we're actually at.
Right.
Which is, okay, the Blazor WebAssembly Standalone was pretty straightforward. With .NET Aspire, we added, in fact, this might be a place where it's okay to bring up some code as we're talking through it.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and present that here. All right. So what we see, and I want to switch to a different thing, but if we look at the solution, which I know, so there was a point where people who may have noticed that a lot of my fonts got really, they got, the only thing I can call it is Visual Studio Standard Small for the Solution Explorer, where they're really tiny. And in the past, I've always gone into the font section and I've tried to make these bigger, but I reset everything the other day because I got this crazy idea to play around with the theme a little bit. So in any case, here's our project, and just in case you're joining us for the first time, and orbital.apphost is that .NET Aspire host, for lack of a better term. It's a distributed app. And what I want to do is open the program CS there, because we can see, if you have any familiarity with .NET Aspire, at least this is a visual way to see what's in the app. We have Azure Cosmos DB. We are using the preview emulator, so that way everything can, as a developer, can remain local on your system. This does mean you have to have the container support for Aspire going, which from what I remember from the documentation, you either can use Podman, Docker Desktop. I mean, I don't think you're limited to those, but those are, I think, the two things that they kind of go through. I don't know what other options there really are there, but we're using Docker Desktop. Okay, and then let's see what else. Next up, we go ahead and have the Aspire integration add a database in Azure Cosmos DB and a container. We have it do that. So finally, we have it add our API. Often we might call it like the backend, but this is the project that the front end spa is going to connect to get things done, and the web app itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of everything. We're looking at the architecture as code here.
Right. Which is one of the awesome things about the app host, right? Because this really defines what, from an overview, this defines what your application does and has access to. And we can use this later on when we go ahead and figure out how we deploy this to, let's say, to Azure, how we might go ahead and get some support for that.
Right. So I think the next thing to point out here is that looking at this architecture as code, what I just said earlier about when you and I just talked about with Azure Functions, that's not here.
Mm-hmm. No.
Because, and the specific reason was, I think we had a little bit of friction with getting the Azure Functions preview support working. And so instead of getting stuck, we just said, well, let's use a minimal API.
Right. Yeah. And that preview support was inside of Aspire. It looks like right now it only supports the triggering side of things as opposed to the other bindings that we were looking to get done.
Okay. All right. So because we made an on-the-fly switch to minimal APIs, we spent a couple episodes working through a couple issues. One of them was, how does the Blazor WebAssembly app in code, how's it going to make its calls? We ended up implementing a typed client, and it's not using the .NET Aspire service discovery because that's not really available for SPA apps. So we actually have in the code right now, like kind of pointing right at the backend API, which is not what we want long term. We'd love for that to come from configuration, be a little more discoverable, something like that. So this is something we've been talking about doing, which is adding a reverse proxy to marshal those calls back over to the same origin, so that we get rid of the CORS issues, and that can forward them to our API. So we created this issue in our GitHub repo mainly to just track this, but also to put down the resources that we're looking at, blog resources, things like that. And so for now, I've got 2 of them in here. I think you might have more that we can add.
Right.
So the point for me is to say, okay, when we kind of discover how to do something, if it comes from documentation or tutorial, then maybe we can just keep it here, or even a lot of times I like to put them in the notes of the videos that you're watching, but just so that way to kind of create a record of how did things get figured out. I went ahead and added another issue because originally the plan was to have the API be a set of Azure functions. And this issue captures the idea of going back and maybe exploring or implementing that. And so here, all I've done, just so we can keep track of this stuff, as I was kind of hoping that would open in another, we'll say open in a new tab, is we've got a blog post, a community blog post here from the Apps on Azure blog that says build and deploy .NET Blazor WASM apps with serverless APIs using Azure Static Web Apps. I figured, okay, let's hang on to this one, because when you take a look at the resources used in this, it's the Blazor WebAssembly Standalone App. That sounds pretty familiar. And then later deploying it to static web apps, which I think, if I recall correctly, early on, we had a GitHub action that did this. In fact, it's still there. The GitHub action is still hanging out in the workflows folder.
Oh, that's right.
But it's pretty much disabled in terms of, like, it's not trying to deploy it on every commit and stuff like that. But we did this. And furthermore, I think even for the heck of it, when we first, I think I just grabbed the files out of my own local folder and threw them in a repo and made it work with GitHub Pages just to see it work.
Right.
And then this is the part we haven't done yet, which is add serverless APIs with Azure Static Web Apps Managed Functions. So I think that's the name of the I don't know if it's the product, but like I don't know what to call it, but I think that's when you mix these things together, right? When you mix together Azure Functions with a static web app, there is support that helps us do this. You're not on your own, I think.
Right. Yeah. There's some of the magic that happens, for lack of a better term, to yeah, as you said, get rid of the cores, have that connection to your static web app code that's running, in our case, running locally inside of that WebAssembly. Have that connection be to that function endpoint securely. So that's another possible way of doing this.
The other thing here is that this particular blog post starts talking about the day-to-day development experience, which is always something I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. And the way this is done is you've got a solution with both projects. How do you start them both up at once? The classic solution of setting up multiple startup projects, which it works. They're not going to complain about it. But let's looking at the date on this post. This is a couple years ago. I don't want to say it was before Aspire, because I think Aspire launched with .NET 8, if I remember correctly. It actually, I think it previewed with .NET 8 and then went GA sometime around build. So, the timing for this is probably about right to say, maybe I won't, you're still going to not quite be ready. And again, we may end up having to think of ways to do this for the day-to-day quality of life work. We're just going to have to see where these different products are at the time. But the point is that this was a pretty complete end-to-end example that I think will be very useful for us. At the same time, there is a learn training path. Publish a Blazor WebAssembly app and .NET API with Azure Static Web Apps. So,
nice.
We'll have the resources to see what others have done and then pick what works for us. But I think it puts us in a funny spot here, and this is what we didn't talk about. We left it on purpose to talk about this live, because otherwise we'd have the conversation twice, right? And so for people that don't know, Rich and I often either chat or talk about, hey, what are we going to do on the show? And it gets very easy to begin having the discussion, right?
Right.
And then realize, well, hold on a second. Now we just got to have it again.
Yeah, we didn't record any of that.
Yeah. So this is two different ways to deploy the API.
Yeah.
They're both perfectly valid ways to do it. And some folks might want to choose different methods. For example, with .NET Aspire helps you in many different ways. My favorite piece is the day-to-day developer quality of life. That happens to be my favorite piece, but it does have deploy to production features.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say, tell me if I'm being unfair to .NET Aspire. I think it's fair to say that right now those features are small and growing. For example, would our only option using everything that's just what's baked into the product is that the API goes to Azure Container Apps?
Right now, right now, if I understand right, all of the pieces that are there, if you create bicep files out of that, are going to send everything to Container Apps. That's right. There's preview components to send things to Azure Functions. So we could split things out that way, but it's a preview feature, and I haven't tried it. So there's that caveat around it.
Yeah, and I think personally that there's no reason you can't get all the benefits from your quality of life, day-to-day developer patterns, the service discovery, the things that are really cool as a developer, and then have either Azure DevOps pipelines or GitHub Actions or whatever system you're using on certain commits or certain automated steps published to whatever you wanted.
Sure.
I mean, who cares, right? It could be to infrastructure as code. It could be, or just infrastructure as a data center. I don't know. Or it could be a static web app, or it could be even an Azure web app, or containers in Kubernetes. Like, who cares?
Yeah. If you think about what you're, I guess one way to look at this is there is a path out of Aspire. using that app host program that you showed to say, well, here's what our infrastructure looks like. And the default path for that is ACA and now some things with functions. In the end, all of that could just be containers, and you can deploy containers wherever you want. So you can take that initial bicep that gets created and modify it for your needs, or write your own action or set of biceps and your actions that deploy those and create those services for you. So it ends up being your code. There's a quick path out of Aspire, but there's also your capabilities to go ahead and modify it and own the rest of that deployment process yourself.
Yeah, right. And so what these two top issues are really talking about two different ways to deploy the API. And that is interesting because now I think we have to ask ourselves, is it worth the effort to support both?
Mm-hmm.
And what are we gaining from it? So I don't know if you have thoughts. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. So can you bring those two issues back?
Okay.
Just because, so we can kind of A/B between them. So the second, so I'm just getting my head around the which one's which. So the first one is make the API deployed to Azure Functions, and then we could use static web apps as the way of hosting that WebAssembly content. Say it that way because that static app is just basically going to bring down the WebAssembly package and it's going to run locally, right? If we do that, the API and the functions make sense to tie both of those together because of all the stuff we kind of mentioned a little bit ago around static web apps is aware of the Azure function that's associated with it and does the mapping for you.
That's true. You're getting the whole feature in one. Right. Because I think what we're going to, I think I know what you're going to say for the second one, but go ahead, because I think that, yes, it shows how they kind of have an incompatibility in terms of deployment.
Well, a little bit they do, because if we think about the second one, our original thought was, hey, this thing is just like I said, it's a WebAssembly. You can download it from that URL, but that means that static web app has no code running there. So if we're talking about having a YARP that sits on the same host domain as the content that we just downloaded, that's not really possible in the architecture we're talking about here. So we really need to kind of rethink that architecture, which is fine. We can say, hey, this can live in an ACA, Azure Container App, or it can live in a web service, whatever. We can figure out what that architecture looks like. But the idea of having it be static web app and some API that lives in the cloud, what we call, we can't really do that with and do a YARP. Now,
I think
Azure
you're right.
Functions might be using a YARP behind the scenes because at least the project, if I recall right, started out as something that was needed for Azure Container Apps, so that you could have functions that are not running and they get called and woken up. So there's that's kind of where that project started out, and then it's grown and it's used in many places around the Azure environment. So, yeah, and I think so. I think let me see. I don't know if it would be easier to try and draw this out. Maybe not. This might end up. We'll see how this goes. So, if we say that. Let's see. First thing I need to do is put in. Yeah. And I will say, if this gets too complex, I can. Whoa, I do have a whiteboard. I can draw it out.
Oh yeah, I was just letting it help me.
I think this is awesome. Keep going.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how this goes. So we have our web browser. Okay, and our web browser is, and right now I'm going to just go ahead and call this, let's call this browser. That'll be the thing that we refer to it. And one method is to reach out to Azure Static Web Apps. Okay. And so I'm gonna actually say spa here. I'm gonna call that component internally spa.
Sure.
And I don't know that we need to give this arrow a name yet, but this doesn't actually have to be Azure Static Web Apps. And I wanna make that clear. It could also be GitHub Pages. It could be, it's basically just I mean, yeah, I suppose it could be net in the fly. It's just basically, a spa. Oh, heck. Just spa served website, essentially. Maybe that's a good term for it. I don't know.
Sure.
It's just files. That's the thing. Statically served files. Oh, looks like I parsed something wrong.
Didn't like the curly or the
I've had issues with that before. I think there's a way to get around it. There it is.
Okay.
So it could be Azure Static Web Apps, it could be GitHub Pages, it could be a spa served website. And then what's going to happen in this particular scenario is I do think I have to have a second one.
Yeah. While you're typing that, I think the important thing with that spa component is no code runs in the cloud or wherever that is hosted. It is just bringing down a way to bring down files to your machine.
That's interesting that it got mad at me. Although it's funny because that is what I wanted. So why don't I take that? Oh, okay. Yeah. Azure Functions API, which is serverless. I think that is one way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Now the other one. Oh, actually. Okay, so I don't want that. I think what I want to do is I think I want to create a new one. Maybe not. It might have all been able to live in one. So for folks that may not know, this is using Markdown support for Mermaid.js, which is a Markdown-based, inspired, I don't know if that's the right term to use, flow charting it as Markdown, basically. Oh, it doesn't like that. Oh, because I didn't put the flowchart type.
Okay. I just dropped a link to the mermaidjs.org site.
Okay. So in the second case, and this is what you were pointing out, is you still have your web browser, and now you have a web server. Because in order to by necessity, we would have to have some kind of web server to host YARP, right?
Right.
And in this case, it's the API is not Azure Functions. Instead, it is an ASP.NET Core hosted minimal API. Now, what is that exactly? I like how it's trying to give me some ideas. This could be Azure Web Apps. It could also be, and the only reason I'm pointing these out is just so that hopefully people who are familiar with different models might look at it and say, oh, okay, I see what you're saying, is that there is some, whether or not it's a single server or multiple server, there's some server back here.
Yep.
The problem with this model was web browser retrieves, the web server, this is hosting the static assets. So the web server is hosting the static assets.
So the WASM will still come down.
Yep. And I mean, I might be changing terminology, so it's basically hosting the Blazor app. So maybe I should call it Blazor WebAssembly, like you said, Blazor WASM assets. That was probably the best way to say it. But the immediate problem that we had here was what did we run to right away is that these come from the web. So this actually doesn't go this direction. I actually don't have this correct, right? It's really that the browser makes its API calls out to the API. That's what was really happening, like that.
And what it's really, what it's really talking to is the WASM sitting at the same host where Blazor is.
Yeah. So is this more accurate? Is that, you
yeah. Let's see where that.
You open the site in your browser. Sorry, once it gets rid of that error, this should be. Oh, did I goof it up? I might have. Oh, I did something, didn't I?
Control C. There you go.
So in the second path, this is what we're currently doing, is technically speaking, we're opening the site in a browser, but the problem is because this site is hosted, when we even look at the app ourselves, orbital.web is its own, this is kind of like its own web host, and Orbital API is a different web host.
Yep, they're going to get deployed as separate endpoints, essentially.
Yeah, so web browser opens the site in the browser, you render the app, then you try to make an API call, and you immediately run into CORS problems. So these are, and again, I think probably some more work could be done here to make these a little bit nicer. But I guess what I wanted to point out, and for the audience too, is that we are looking to add this kind of this documentation right into the documents in the GitHub repo, and I was really excited to try and start to use Mermaid to be our whiteboarding. Sometimes it's going to be way too hard to do things the way we did, but at least save it as code. Maybe we draw things out sometimes just to freeform it, but then try to see how much we can save as code, just because then it's easy to version, stuff like that.
Right. And so let me see it. And if this is the path you want to go down, we can stop. But basically, we've got two different architectures of how we might deploy this application is what it's coming down to.
Right.
And there's different ways of solving the problem that we're definitely running into by using WASM, which is how do we securely connect to those backend APIs? And static web apps gives us a way to get there, but we've got to use Azure Functions, which is fine. We can figure that out. Or there's a path from the web browser to some of the standard services, some of the other services that we have in Azure that have compute associated with them, like some kind of web component, and then some kind of place where the APIs might run. Now, the reason we're considering those and pointing those out is because there's a different cost model for those kinds of services, right? Static web apps, there is no compute associated with it. It's just basically a CDN. So there's potentially a lesser charge there. Same thing with Azure Functions, right? Azure Functions, you only pay for the cost when those are up and running. So in a lightweight site like this, that could be a valuable option to have an inexpensive app running in the Azure environment, if we architect it for that. The other way certainly can work, and there are methods inside of things like Azure Container Apps where you can spin them down and say the minimum number of containers running is 0, in which case that application, if there's no traffic to it, would also essentially be in almost like a serverless kind of mode. So you've got some capabilities there for both architectures to lessen the amount of impact from a financial perspective to running your application in Azure.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, and I'd love to know what people think about it if they're watching, like either now or in the future. Is it as a team? How do you figure out the cost benefit to enabling multiple ways to do things? Because to me, there's pros and cons, of course. There's always just the simple principle of you're not going to need it, so like don't do more than you need to do.
Right.
more. I didn't say the acronym correctly. I could have said you ain't gonna need it, which is the YAGNI.
YAGNI.
But then and here's the thing where you got to decide if you're over engineering is if you enable the business that you work for to have multiple ways to do things, you have transformed technical problems into business decisions. It is no longer a technical issue. The business does not have to say to you, we looked at this and it's kind of expensive. So how much is it going to cost us to change models? And you say, look, we've designed this application in such a way that changing models is low to minimal cost. So therefore, it is now your business decision. It's not a technical problem anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But with that comes engineering. So,
there's a little bit of a switch up of how we do the infrastructure as code, how we deploy all of this, right? So we could keep, even with both of those, and I don't think we have it necessarily on the API layer in the bottom one, but there's no reason we couldn't just say our API layer will be Azure Functions, regardless of which model. Because what happens is you could certainly deploy it to Azure Functions as a service, or if we're saying everything is going to live inside of this Azure Container Apps world, you can deploy an Azure function into an Azure Container App as a, functions as a container essentially. So your infrastructure doesn't change. It's just, I guess it is. Your infrastructure doesn't change if you say, hey, we're going to rally around the API layer being Azure Functions. And then now you have that flexibility to deploy to either one of those models, depending on what makes the most sense for your business customer, essentially.
Yeah. Here, I'm going to put a question mark here because the whole idea is stop is ending the core's problems. So you know what? You're right. Is that to say ASP.NET Core hosted minimal API? Oh, actually, so the Azure Functions doesn't quite fit in yet here, just because that box is saying that
it's
box is
API.
Basically declaring that you used a minimal API, where this box is declaring that an Azure function was used.
Yeah, that's true.
So, however, you're right that there could be a third diagram where you still went this way. You still hosted the site somewhere. I don't know where it is, but some kind of web server. For all I know, it's in your data center. Or it could be Azure Web Apps, or it doesn't matter. But that we still use Azure Functions to be, so it still goes in two directions. Like here's where I got the assets from, and here's where I go to get them. Because like in order to, one of the ways, if minimal API is used here, this is where we needed YARP, right?
Yeah, because we're going to use that as the front end to then route the traffic to the appropriate API endpoint, because it would have all the, that you got it.
So in that case, the way this really looks is browser to YARP. And I love how it finished that off for me. And then we change this to YARP to cores. And now it looks like this. And the reason is to use YARP is because now we're basically saying that these go away.
Yep. And a number of other things that we haven't talked about yet related to authentication and configuration and those kind of things.
Right. We haven't gotten to authentication yet, which is important because the app does have authentication needs. We want certain users to be able to do certain things. And so those have to be solved for as well. But I think, go ahead.
Just to carry on that point, that's one of the, and we talked about this kind of offline, that's one of the hesitations I have to deploying this to a cloud environment, especially doing this live on a show and seeing kind of where this is going, is we want to get the authentication in first before we go ahead and deploy this out. Because then we've got some coverage. I mean, we can make the site not public and, shut things down that way, but
I guess part of it too is that, like, I was okay with us figuring out how to, and it doesn't have this, I don't know how, there could be a pipeline that does this, that perhaps deploys it to a public safe space where we basically say like, look, if you mess it up, we don't care. Because this isn't the live version. This is just you want to try this out, you want to see it work, and whatever you do with it, knock yourself out, right? But and the thing about that version that I was thinking about is that maybe it's not backed by a potentially expensive resource. That if somebody decided like, oh, I'm going to increase your spend by like storing 1 trillion meetings.
Yeah.
That instead you say like, okay, look, this thing works in memory.
Right.
And who cares? It resets every 10 minutes or whatever. Now, look, that's all engineering work that I think we would do just for the sake of public display.
Right.
But sometimes those kinds of things are valuable because if you have those capabilities in your app, then I think it puts you in a position. How many times have, I mean, I'm going to say, I'll answer for myself. I won't try to put anybody else on the spot. Have you worked with an app where deploying it has become a little bit, I don't want to even call it a chore. It's become a little bit of a mystery because the way version 1 got out there was the database is out there and ready. And now this is out and ready and this is out and ready. And we've started using it. And so now you kind of ask like, well, what if we wanted another one of these? Well, we need a database back in that initial state. What was that?
Yeah.
Is it really just blank tables or like happens very oftenly in many apps, was it the schema plus a little bit of seeding? And maybe that seeding was done manually because you got it working. It works. We're making money. It's in production. We have customers. But I need another one of these. Well, what was that initial seeding? I don't know.
It's often. I know you get to those things in that use case of, well, I've got 0 records for this thing. And it's kind of, well, we've never had 0 records. There are always records.
Yeah. What were the initial settings? What was the initial seeding? Can you deploy this thing from scratch? Can you start over? And there's actually value in that I think it's so easy to overlook. It is so easy to overlook that as value. And you've gotten it into your production environment. Your customers are using it. They're happy. It's growing. And now it's grown past where you don't remember how you started. Yeah. It sounds like, how could that ever happen? And it always happens.
We've all been there. So it has to happen.
So that's kind of what I was thinking there. So we didn't, let's see. I do want to kind of clean this up a little bit. Like, I think there's some interesting things I can do to separate these. I'm not sure if it's all going to blow up if I do it, but I think I can add some front matter here. Okay, and which one did I add it to? I added it to the second one. And so I don't really need all of this stuff. Oh, I did actually make the theme bigger, which is kind of something I wanted.
Oh, wow. Okay. I like this. This is pretty cool. I haven't played around with it enough.
Well, doing it on the fly is a little interesting, but I don't know what to call this. Is this like server based? Is this like server based? Is that what this is?
Or is it
the second one? Is it server based and the first one is serverless based? I'm sure my terms my naming that I'm using here is terrible.
I would call it, the second one, it's almost like compute, there's a compute aspect to it that we don't have in the first one.
Okay.
Server-based site.
See, isn't it fun? Naming this stuff is fun. But it does look like when we have that figured out that I can separate these and this could live in one of our diagrams.
Right.
So
that's pretty cool.
That's kind of nice. And I can do something like that to separate it. So sorry, I'm having a little too much fun with this thing.
What is that 3? Why are they? Why is one raised up in the middle?
That didn't do what I wanted at all. Oh, okay. So my code, I am using Cascadia code, and so you can see what's happening with Cascadia code with the gosh, there's a name for this stuff with the the name's going to escape me, so I feel terrible. But it's where many IDEs editors are supporting fonts where if I want to type 2 dashes and put a arrow, what happens is the font automatically transforms it to that glyph.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
So
Okay.
let me give you another one. The JavaScript equals, the very common JavaScript equals that we're all used to, or many languages have a double equals to mean, is it equal to a comparison operator?
Yep.
See how it automatically combines it?
Okay.
And then
Makes
in
it a little bigger.
JavaScript, we have not only is it equal, is it the same type of object? That's the 3.
Oh, wow. The 3 one.
Or
Nice.
I could say this one. If I do colon.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Some people love this.
Yeah.
There's your lambda symbol.
Yeah.
And there's another one. There's another glyph that's interesting. www gets transformed.
Okay.
There's all kinds of them. Well, it turns out that the markdown way to add a horizontal line is 3 asterisks. And if you put in 3 asterisks, it transforms the glyph. That's all that is. Now,
okay.
I want to be clear. What's
I'm trying
interesting
to think how
about
you do
this,
a shift star.
Yeah. What's interesting about this, so I'm using Cascadia code, is our good friend Jeff Fritz was using this because this is built into Visual Studio. I'm not sure if it's how it shipped in the latest version, but if you go use preview, you're going to have all these glyphs lighting up and everything. And he was using this for a while on stream, and then he stopped. And he stopped because time and again, he was getting questions like, how do you create that? What did you type to make the long arrow? And so he stopped mainly to avoid the confusion, not because he said, that's a real reasonable thing to ask. And it's kind of interfering with the flow of I'd rather people just focus on what we're getting done than get lost into what did you just do?
Yeah.
I've gone back and forth on whether I like it or not, but so we only have a few minutes left. In order to enable this,
okay,
and I don't know how much we'll draw here. In order to enable this, and I really hope to go back to this video because I think this one could be really great to chapter. We could have a chapter here that kind of says how to enable this architecture. One thing we would have to do, because if you're familiar with the project today, if we go to the Orbital API, the implementation to talk to Cosmos is right here.
Yeah.
It is all here in one spot in the API. I mean, if we were using controllers, we could have done the same thing. It all lives here. So the question would be, okay, it looks like there are patterns that need to come out. For example, the talking to Cosmos DB, I would say likely just completely comes out of the API app, probably into a project that represents it. It's probably a repository. And so instead, the API talks to a repository that says, look, go get me the meetings. Go get me this particular meeting. I don't know how you do it. I don't care. And now we're on our way to the repository pattern with this one talks to Azure Cosmos DB. Perhaps this other one is in memory. I don't know. Right. That's probably one piece of it. But an interesting other piece would be there's the API app for minimal APIs. Is there another project for the Azure Functions implementation? And is there even any shared code in there that we would find that we say, okay, the API, minimal API app and the Azure function, they are dealing with all the intricacies of their worlds. I understand my HTTP request here is a minimal API. As an Azure function, I probably have access to all of the same things, but I also have whatever in my world being an Azure function. But when it comes time to go get the information, maybe there's some shared code there, or maybe it's that would be so much abstraction that it's like, you know what? They're both calling the Cosmos service or I'm sorry, actually our meetings database service, whatever we call it, that's fine.
Right. Yeah. There's the way with that binding component, the way that the function connects to Cosmos database is different than what we've been doing here with the Cosmos client, which is probably why we can't wire it up the same way in Aspire to say use the emulator, right? We'd have to go a different path to be able to do that with a function.
Right. So, I think one of the keys is like there's this double-edged sword of like trying not to get too caught up in the perfect solution because we want to move forward. Like, for example, we're not going to see any new features today or anything like that, but hopefully talking it through helps. Besides just ourselves, helps helps others say like, oh, okay, these are things that maybe we consider too. Like here's one of those glyphs I was talking about, Cascadia code here.
Oh yeah, nice.
So
okay,
yeah,
cool.
So this is where we are now. We know it's not where we want to end up. We know that this should look more of, in fact, you can imagine there's hardly any code here at all, except go get the meetings.
Right.
And if they come back in any kind of form, even an empty array, I think we're okay. And if something bad comes back, then we're returning a different result.
Yeah.
Whereas in this case, we're saying, okay, go get the meetings. And if a meeting comes back, great, return it. If whatever repository we call says, hey, that meeting doesn't exist, now we have our results not found. And we're not using what this is, I'm already not super thrilled about this because we're basically using exception handling to figure out whether or not we have a meeting. I don't think we have to do it this way. I just think that this is just what we landed on to get it working.
Yeah. Oh, agreed. We were basically vibe coding with Ghost text and saying, yep, that looks good. It was right near the end of the show when we wrote this. And I think the other thing we can do here, if we're going minimal API, is start to pull those endpoints out so that everything's not all polluted inside of the programs.cs, right? We can make this a little more digestible.
Yep. So there's definitely some work to do. I would like to get this added. And one thing I want to do is, make our README a little bit better. Right now, there's really not much going on here, but I think slowly but surely we can add instructions like, hey, here's how to run this for yourself. And then I think what I did, I haven't committed this, is I created a docs folder. We'll have to figure out if this is what we want to call it, but I was hoping that this would be useful. I mean, I am getting very interested in working with Mermaid.js because I like the idea as much as possible of having charts as code. I think sometimes it's probably not practical, and so then you go ahead and you use whatever charting tool you have. But it can be annoying if you have to change a dozen things in your charting tool, and you realize that you're like trying to get everything lined up just perfectly. So I don't know. It was something I wanted to try.
No, I love it. And we did some demos for customers where we take what we did on the whiteboard, hand drawn, and use one of the models that understands images, the large language models like GPT. Although GPTs, some of them do it, some don't. But basically there are models that will understand an image and say, well, based on that image, generate the mermaid text so that we can save it as a document, right? Because you need some way to make it actionable. I mean, you can have the whiteboard around, but this gives you now something you can modify this way.
That's pretty cool. The other thing that because I was wondering if it would generate, like you said, generate mermaid text. Okay. Also maybe generate, I don't know, a different tool so that even though maybe it's still a visual tool, at least everything's been taken off the whiteboard so that you can start moving the boxes around, because that's the thing about the whiteboard is it's on there and you're stuck. So unless it's a digital whiteboard where some of them, and heck, I've talked about this on the show. I used to work on one where, you can grab a piece that you drew and move it around, make it bigger. That was fun stuff to work on because I really saw the potential in that being the future digital whiteboard, which the Microsoft Whiteboard app does support in a lot of ways now. So, and other whiteboards do too. So, yeah. All right. We're getting close to 9. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we want to get back to code.
Yeah. And sometimes you got to take a step back from the code and just kind of talk through things. And I think that's what today was for us as well, because we'd been doing a lot of that offline and thought that let's just do it here.
Yeah, right. And not have to repeat it, but and at the same time get it in a place where maybe people can benefit from it, because I think what we had realized is that without making it clear what we're trying to do, it might be like, why are you doing X, Y, or Z? Well, because this is where we're at right now. The second section is kind of where we're at today. This is what the app is right now, except we don't have this in yet. And right now the web browser is going to the web server. And then what's happening is we were having it was going here, trying to get here. And how did we solve it? We did the use cores and we just basically said, allow everything. But that's how we solved it locally. Right. And the reason is because we're going to these two different origins, and this is actually showing where we want to get to. So I think this is everything. The database is back here, so on. All right, cool. Great. Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Good stuff.
Yeah, it was good. Way to start our week off there. And let's see if I do this. Is that going to be okay? Good.
Yeah, there you go.
That all worked.
Yes, it all worked. Scooter is happy.
Yeah, has he been back there the whole time?
Yes.
He didn't have many complaints about this show. Maybe he's been all riled up because he says, "Why are you just coding? You got to do a little bit of your planning, just a little, right? No, we're not looking for big upfront design, but a little bit of planning." So in the meantime,
the plan.
Yeah. In the meantime, we'll see you all later in the week. I think there will be at least another show. I wish I had the exact date for you, but stay tuned here. We really appreciate folks watching live. Love your comments. Thank you so much for everyone who has commented, whether it's here in comments on the show or after the fact on specific videos. It's really helpful. And the fact that anyone here would take their time to comment, critique, and help with, hey, this is what's helping me, and this would help me more. That's fantastic. So we are definitely listening. Do not believe for a second that we're not. Other than that,
appreciate all those. Yes.
Yeah, greatly appreciated. And we're actually going to talk about some of them more specifically, I think, in a future episode. So,
yes.
In order to get us going, we'll get out of here. So for everybody, for Rich, I'm Chris, and you are everybody, and we'll see you all next time on the Dev Talk Show.